Wow, that was some great straight talk on an incredibly difficult issue that the world is facing. That was amazing. As we talk about these global goals that have been discussed in just about every conversation we've had, the one thing that keeps coming up is data. We need good data to know how we deploy and how we take on and create success on these goals. And we're going to take a deep dive in the next conversation on that, which is entitled Data, the Life Force of Decision Making. So please join me in welcoming Haile Owusu, the Chief Data Scientist at Mashable, Bill Hoffman, Head of Data-Driven Development at the World Economic Forum, Melissa Rowley, Founder and CEO of Humanize, Shamina Singh, Executive Director of MasterCard's Center for Inclusive Growth, and Emily Corey Pryor, Senior Director of Data2X. Let's give them a warm SGS welcome.
Are we?
Well, data is a lifeblood of decision making, and it is it's hopefully the key component in deciding how many women, men and children still live in poverty, how many children need educating. Perhaps you could each take a few moments to tell the audience the organization that you work for and the primary problems that you are hoping to address and the type of populations that you're dealing with and the data that you hope to surface to address those problems.
Sure. So we are Humanize. We just launched last week, and we promote human rights through technology and storytelling. Data-driven storytelling specifically, which is crucial because we all know that numbers tell stories. But while we're collecting data and mining data and having all these conversations around it, it's really important that we all remember that people tell stories. Mm-hmm. So every time there is a stat, every time there's a piece of data or a number that's put forward, we need to connect it and bring it back to the people, bring it back to the humanity of everything. Right now we're focused on Detroit, which many of you might know is a first world city crawling with third world problems. 40% of the people there don't have internet access. 39% of the people there are living under the poverty line. These are huge issues that can potentially be addressed by data. One of the organizations that we've done some storytelling around is called Data-Driven Detroit. And what they do is they bring participants of the local communities they're looking to serve and have them collect the data with them. So if they're going into a neighborhood and looking at the cause of blight removal and looking at the housing crisis, they bring the residents in to identify the problems and to share with them what they think needs to be done with the data. And it's an important conversation to be had because people in their local communities know what's needed most. They know what their culture is. They know what their needs are. It's very easy for us to say what we think we should do for them and with them, but it needs to be a collaborative down-up approach. And so we're looking to just promote that kind of data collection participation and bring the data back to the people and make sure that the people are there to tell their stories alongside it.
Shamina, you're with the Executive Director of MasterCard's Center of Inclusive Growth. I imagine that the range of data challenges that you consider is very wide. Perhaps you could share.
Sure. And it's a pleasure to be on the panel with such an esteemed group, so thanks for having me here. I think most people, when they think about MasterCard as a corporation, probably think about something that it probably isn't. So MasterCard is not a credit card company and it's not a bank. So it's basically the technology that connects buyers and sellers in about 210 countries at a rate of 2 times faster than the blink of an eye. But the interesting thing for this panel is that, and I wrote this down because I was even a little bit surprised, that the MasterCard network, the technology network, processes over 43 billion pieces of information per second. So you can imagine when people talk about big data and they think about what happens with the big data, MasterCard as a corporation has access and is in a place where it can help use data for good. So we created the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth as an independent subsidiary of MasterCard, the nonprofit side, to basically work with our corporate partners to take those data assets and figure out how we can solve big social problems. And I have to tell you, we're looking at everything from Ebola to water to economic development to tourism. So you can imagine with that kind of access and the partnerships with people like the folks here, that there's an enormous opportunity to actually take that data out of that mysterious black box, because I don't think anybody really knows what big data is. I don't. Big data means what big data does. But sort of take it out of that black box and actually make it practically useful to actually do some social good.
Brilliant. So Bill Hoffman is the head of data-driven development at the World Economic Forum, and I suspect that in our discussions you spoke essentially teasing out data from businesses as a way of leveraging the data that they've accumulated to solve developmental problems. Perhaps you could.
Sure. So the work that I'm leading at the World Economic Forum is a global multi-stakeholder community. So MasterCard is one of the partners, but we have civil society and governments and a number of NGOs, and essentially trying to strike a balance in the use of data. One of the phrases that comes up, and I guess given the moon last night, is that we're all pointing at the moon and looking at our finger, right? And it's really not about the data. It's the impact and the usage, and how do we use it in manners that are fair, inclusive, equitable, innovative, scalable. But it's really not the bits per se, but it's the impact. And so what we're just now beginning to understand is how do we understand the use of data in a manner that upholds and maintains the integrity of a given context. We love and hate data, right? And so the same data that can give tremendous transformative results can do the exact opposite to extreme measures. And we've heard a number of those instances as well. So it's really about balance and having collectively the mechanisms there to understand, and that everybody gets a voice. And we're just beginning that journey, and we're seeing some tremendous innovation and hope. The work in Detroit is a great example.
Before, perhaps you could talk a little bit about the work that you did in Detroit. I understand that that there was a collaboration of sorts between the two.
Bill is the reason we exist, I think, in a lot of ways. So Humanize powers a platform called the toolbox.org, which was founded by Peter Gabriel, the rock star, who's also an iconic humanitarian. And we were founded as an online destination that promotes tools, mainly mobile apps, that aid social change in some way. So we address financial inclusion, we address gender equality, we address education, human trafficking. We have over 700 tools, and we create stories where those tools can be integrated and be of use. So it's really a site that can help people become everyday activists, in a sense. And we've been around for about a year in perpetual beta. And what we discovered is that, okay, we've got these tools and we've got stories, but we need offline local engagement with people. We need to actually talk to people and get them using the tools, get user feedback, and ask them, how can these tools be more human-centered and be more applicable for your actual neighborhood? And so Bill suggested going to Detroit and talking with people because there's so much work being done there. I grew up an hour outside of Detroit, so it hit home for me. And there, a lot of the storytelling around Detroit is that a new Detroit is happening, and it is. There's a lot of community investment going into one specific area, mainly downtown. There's a lot of jobs and properties being built, which is providing jobs. And there's tech innovation hubs, and there's a slew of great things happening. There is a new Detroit, but there's still the old Detroit. There are the neighborhoods, and there's a great racial divide where people want to be included, and they want to be a part of the conversation, and they're not. So they're not receiving any community investment. Like I said before, 40% of them don't have internet access. So we're working on trying to bridge the socioeconomic divide between tools and trying to provide digital inclusion. We've got a smart city provider partner called P3GM, and they provide real estate and make sure that's available for companies like the big tech companies to come in and provide technology solutions. We need to get them digital inclusion and then deploy the tools and get them talking. And Bill was really instrumental in just bringing that data. Am I kissing your butt too much? Bill was instrumental in keeping, he's my advisor too.
No shame.
Bill was instrumental in bringing that data component into the toolbox and into what has now become Humanize.
Brilliant. So Emily Pryor, you're of the UN Foundation Data 2X initiative. And in the scenario Melissa just described, there's a situation essentially in which there's data that could be provided by the people of Detroit, but presently isn't, and she's actively engaged in increasing that sort of release of data. But perhaps you could talk a little bit about Data 2X and the ways in which gender asymmetric data is absent, and the need for there to be more data, particularly about women, to solve these problems?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and thanks, Haile, and thanks to all the panelists. Bill is very modest because he just turned and asked me to insult him, but I can't think of a way to insult you, Bill, other than to say that one of the chief challenges we have is, Bill, I agree with Bill that the importance of data is a tool and it's about impact and use of data, but I also slightly disagree and would say there's a pre-step to that, which is that if we don't have data on everyone, if women and girls make up a half of the global population and we don't have the reliable data, then we're not going to be able to have the right targeted kind of impact and use that we really need. And I think that the way that data collection systems are currently designed and used are not set up in a way that accurately reflect the lives and the realities of women and girls. And that's really what Data 2X is about, and why we were founded, and why we're based at the UN Foundation, is really as we anticipate this next incredible moment that we have of the Sustainable Development Goals and thinking about what we want for 2030, we really have an opportunity to push the reset button. We've been talking a lot about data revolution, and that's very important, but in order to truly have a revolution, we need to ensure that everyone's being counted. And Haile and I were talking before the break, because, and I get this question a lot, well, what does gender data mean? Or, oh, you're talking about disaggregation. Absolutely, I'm talking about disaggregation, and that doesn't always happen, because to disaggregate, to ask individuals the same questions, that kind of doubles the cost, right? So there's a financial aspect there in terms of how data is collected and disaggregated, but it goes deeper than that. It's really thinking about what are the ways that surveys are designed. A lot of surveys are designed in the way that we get the information that builds the case for and builds the targets for things like the Sustainable Development Goals or the Millennium Development Goals are based on surveys that might look for, a head of the household. And they might walk into a household and say, oh, Bill, you're the man. You must be the head of the household. I'm not trying to insult you with that, but, but you must be the head of the household, and I'm going to aim my questions at you. And the woman in that household might have different answers for what, for those questions that reflect something different about what's happening within that household and what's happening within a community. And so I think that kind of links back to your point as well, Melissa, about communities being more engaged and kind of communities driving data as well. And I think we have this moment to really say, when we're talking about data, when we're talking about the data revolution, when we're talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, we can't have it requires data equality. There has to be data equality if we want to achieve gender equality. So.
Well, and that was one of the things that we were talking about actually earlier, if it's okay if I jump in.
Please, yeah.
Was the notion of identity being at the core of all of this, because I agree 100%. Data equality has to be there for gender equality. But at its core, if you don't have identification, if you're not counted physically, and it may sound weird because we're in the United States, but in India, in Nigeria, South Africa, as a rule, all the populations aren't counted. They don't do census every 10 years like they do in the United States. So actually being counted is a pretty big deal, and it's a pretty expensive thing. Yeah. One of the things that we've been working on is working with governments in these countries, in Mexico and others, to work with the governments to help them provide financial identity. To sort of say, if you have financial identity, what we call smart identity, then you're being counted as part of the normal course of affairs. Because once you get financial identity and you're able to transact, you're able to have a bank account, you're part of the formal financial economy, you start to get transactions, you start to get your social subsidies counted. You become counted as a human being. And I think it's hard for us to understand here sort of in developed markets, but you were even talking about Detroit and how 40% of people in Detroit don't have financial identity.
Well, they don't have internet access. I'm not sure about financial identity, but to your point, some of the technology that you've got to measure the proxies and everything to see that they might be counted, and that will help them get financial inclusion. Right. One of our partners in Guinea, which is an organization called There Is No Limit Foundation, they're working a lot on the post-Ebola recovery over there. And my colleague there had mentioned that there's very little data around women in remote villages.
Right.
And so they're not able to get credit access.
Right.
So it's really the lack of data or poor data around women, around gender disparities, that's also continuing to perpetuate these kind of problems.
Right. And we were talking about the idea of credit proxy and how right now, if you think about your credit score in the United States and developed markets, they look at your assets. They look at what you can put up. Do you have an apartment? Do you have a car payment? Things like that. If you're in Guinea, or if you're in remote villages in India, or if you're in Johannesburg, you may or may not have these assets because you don't have access to the formal economy. So you don't have an identification that allows you access to a bank account, that allows you access to credit. So one of the things we've been sort of doing research on at the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth is around this idea of proxies for credit. So can you look at transaction history? Can you look at savings rather than spend? Can you look at if you're spending money on education or bread or milk versus booze? Is that should also be considered proxy for behavior, which at the end of the day is why you want to lend somebody money, is based on whether or not they'll pay you back. And so those are the types of things that we're working on.
You're looking at who is contributing to their community and reinvesting it the most.
Exactly.
In a lot of cases, it's women.
Exactly.
And
in most cases.
in a lot of cases, it's women in the developing
Actually,
world.
to be honest, between you, do you have a sort of a sense of the missing economic component, a sort of percentage of the missing economic component that's lost essentially by missing data about women?
Well, I think one thing that I can say about that, and then you might have a
Yeah.
really interesting private sector perspective, but so we did a scan of looking across all global data sets that exist, all of the household surveys, all of the various streams of data that are out there, and we looked at it across health, education, political participation, peace and security, and at economics, and we found 28 of those gaps. And 10 of those gaps are in economic opportunity and economic participation. That is an area where we just do not have a lot of information, and it's because of the way that systems are valuing women and are looking at women as reproducers rather than as producers and economic drivers. And I have reproduced twice. My children are my proudest accomplishments, but they're not my only accomplishments. They're not my only achievements, So I think that it's really important, and that's the economic piece is particularly, and I would love also the World Economic Forum's perspective on this too, is really particularly ripe and poised for some data filling to happen so that we can better kind of think about how women and girls become drivers of economies around the world.
So yeah, it's maybe to build off the reproduction, women need production rights of the digital data they create, right? So the metaphor would be every time a woman or any individual turns on the phone, there's an opportunity to get paid, right? That the models right now are extractive, right? Large entities extract the data, use it, and then make decisions, and that could change. And I think particularly in the emerging economies, being able to enable people with production rights in a certain context for, okay, these are the pictures I took, these are the samples I took. There's a number of interesting startups that are paying people to go out and take pictures, right, of what a bag of rice costs. And that level of granularity, that level of data literacy is something that I think not only creates jobs for individuals, but starts to put the value of production closer to the individual and not necessarily some of the grand multinationals. The other thing I'd add too is I think part of the challenge is this notion of local understandings and local data literacy. That right now, we lack a rich understanding of the local context. And so before we're going to use data, we really need to understand how the lives and the impact is going to happen at a local level. And so we need to build out those capacities, I think, at scale, because the resilience, the trust, all of the change is going to happen locally. And so we need to engage more effectively, I would say, at the edge.
How do we make sure the Sustainable Development Goals are reached at a local level and those local neighborhood contexts are brought into the conversation around the goals?
Yep.
And one of the things I think that people here can do is, one of the things is partner with other organizations that are doing this work. So all the organizations that are out there doing this kind of work. I know that, for example, we have this priceless pitch elevator right out here that says, if you go in there and do 60 seconds on whatever you're working on around social impact or poverty, $500 for every pitch goes to DataKind. And DataKind is a fantastic organization because what they're doing is they're taking data scientists like the ones at Mashable, the ones at MasterCard, the ones at these organizations, and they're putting them out into the community. And they're saying, data scientists are our I mean, you guys are the kernel of greatness. And so it's sort of like, we need to get people with your brains, not only doing the work for companies like MasterCard and Mashable and things like that, but we need to get your brains working in Detroit, and we need to get your brains working in Madagascar. And I think that DataKind is one of those organizations that helps aggregate smart data scientists and put them out into the field. So I would encourage everybody to please help us get to our goal to give DataKind a big fat pile of money by doing your pitch outside.
DataKind is an extraordinary organization, and they are a number of my colleagues are active participants in DataKind. You're very generous. I think we've ran significantly over time. I could.
How much? Just curious.
It's
3 minutes and
3 minutes and
47
47
Oh,
seconds.
it's nothing.
9. It's been, I could listen to you guys talk, frankly, all afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Brilliant.